back for another episode of The Wandering Middle Eastern Teacher. So I am Abu Laith, and today I am here with Miss Crystal DeLong. First, thank you for being here.
Of course.
So today's episode, we're going to bring out another unique aspect in teaching. We're going to be talking a lot about international context of teaching, in case some of you have questions, have thought about that, or you're in that context now and feel a little lost. So first question, Crystal, why did you get involved in education? Why did you start being a teacher?
Well, I've always wanted to be a teacher. When I was in kindergarten, they used to call me Teacher DeLong. So I have always wanted to be a teacher. But I love history, and I have a passion for history, and I have a passion to share that with others. And I always tell my kids that I get paid to talk for a living because I love to talk too. So it does seem like a natural fit. But I love to help people, and that moment that you're working with a student and you see that aha moment when they get it and they have that, make that connection and understand, especially for me as a high school teacher, like my content is important. And so to understand like why history matters, why it's important. Mm-hmm. And so for that, all those are just some of the reasons that I chose to become a teacher. Yeah. You definitely don't do it for the money. You right. Become a teacher because you want to make a difference.
Right. So what has been your experience in education? Where have you taught? What have you taught? Whom have you taught?
So this is getting ready to start my 23rd year of teaching.
Wow, congratulations.
Thanks. And so I started teaching right outside of college, and I have taught, so of the 23 years, all of them have been spent in Virginia in Bedford County Public Schools, except for 6 years that I spent overseas. And so I spent 4 years teaching an international school in Turkey and 2 in an international school in Morocco. And I have taught pretty much any history or social studies course that you can imagine from 5th grade up to 12th grade. And actually it's over 20 different courses. So often in international schools, if you're in a small school, you are the history department, and so you kind of teach a little bit of everything. So I've done U.S. history, world history, government, geography, a little bit of everything. Mm-hmm.
What's been your favorite to teach?
Well, in college, I really got a passion for world history, and especially as I began to travel overseas. I was in my mid-20s the first time I went overseas, and it's that moment of, oh my gosh, America is such a baby country, and there's so much history in the rest of the world. And so I also, growing up, I loved debating and discussing, and so world religions was always a really interesting thing for me. And so that's one of the reasons I really enjoy world history, because there's a lot of that, and you see the influence of religion, and it's so important even in today's world to understand that. One of my big goals that I have for my students is for them to see themselves as global citizens. And I think that that's so important. As Americans, we often are very kind of egocentric and kind of forget that there's a whole big world out there. And so that's one of the things that I really try to do for my students. And living overseas and traveling, like, it's made history come even more alive in my classroom. Like, it's one thing when you can talk about the Ottoman Empire, and it's nothing when you can show them the pictures and like, hey, this is this or that. And so I love teaching world history. And I also, government is one of my favorites. I do have my master's in international education, but I also have enough credit hours, master's level, for political science to do dual enrollment government. And so I've been teaching AP US government and AP comparative for the last 8 years. And that is one of my absolute favorite things to teach. So anytime that I can bring in any kind of international aspect into my history and government classes in America, I love to do that.
Yeah. All right, so let's get into kind of some bigger, deeper questions. First, can you kind of just describe what's it like teaching at an international school? What's the same as teaching at a school in America, and what's different?
Okay. So when I moved to Turkey, it was definitely different going from teaching in a public school to teaching in a private school. Yeah. So international schools are hands down going to be private schools. And so that was a big shift for me, moving from that kind of sense. And then, you know, when you're teaching your content, a lot of that is the same, but you also have to consider your audience. So, for example, when I was teaching U.S. history to a class full of students who were not U.S. citizens, how do you make it relevant to them?
Yes.
Or when I'm teaching world history and maybe there was one little paragraph in our book about something that happened in Korea, and yet I have 4 students who are South Korean, and how do you deal with that? There's also the aspects of teaching World War II becomes a little different when you have a South Korean and a Japanese student in your classroom. And I learned a lot. For example, I knew a lot about what the Japanese had done to the Chinese, but I didn't realize like what the Japanese had done to the Koreans. And so navigating and learning that myself, becoming more educated about the history and culture of my students, and then also being respectful of the fact that I have 2 different people groups who have been enemies, but yet get along in my classroom. It was the same thing having Macedonians and Greeks and Turks in a classroom. There's, if you know anything about Turks and Greeks, they don't get along very well. And so you have to think about those things. One of my most rewarding classes I ever taught was I taught a geography class, world geography, and I had 18 students and they were from 14 different countries.
Wow.
And so what a rich class. And it also provided opportunities for my students to teach me. Sometimes in international schools, when you have third culture kids, TCKs, which are students who are children who are living outside of their passport country, and that experience becomes, so you have the first culture of your passport country, your second culture of the country you're living in, and then that third culture of kind of being in this kind of different situation. And so sometimes students have been outside of their parent culture or passport country so long, they have not even a knowledge of their own history or their own culture. And so there was kind of some learning opportunities in that sense as well. In one sense, teaching content is a lot the same, but I think you also have to be very considerate of your audience. For example, after my experiences in Morocco, I had always thought, like when we talk about the Ottoman Empire, we say that it spread across North Africa. Well, they didn't get Morocco. And when I got to Morocco, the Moroccans were like, hey, the Ottomans didn't take us over. And so I'm like, so now when I teach that, I'm like, they went all the way except to Morocco. And we talk about how the Moroccans fought. Or when I teach about World War II, I always now talk about Operation Torch, which was kind of in the North African movement. And so those experiences that I've had have helped kind of change my own teaching and made it richer. But I think content is a big thing. It's different in international and making sure you're understanding your audience. I would say the hardest thing or the biggest challenging thing at international school was the cultural differences. And so I think it depends on the body of your school. And so, for example, in Morocco, my students were largely an Arab population. And I did not have an Arab population in Turkey. I only had a very small. I had some students who were from the UAE, but that was really my only experience with Arab culture. So what I learned when I got to Morocco was having a lot of problems with classroom management and different things. And I was teaching 6th grade, which is maybe not my favorite grade. And one of the things that I began to understand about Moroccan culture, which I understand is true of a lot of Arab culture, is that it's a lot of oral storytelling. And so storytelling is very much a part of their culture. And I began to realize that if I did my lectures as a story, that my students were much more engaged. And so learning more about the culture I was living in and the culture of my students helped me be a better teacher, helped me get better classroom management and kind of understand where they were coming from.
Wow, that's a really good insight. I wish I had been that aware when I taught in the Middle East. Would have helped me a lot.
I asked advice from a lot of other people. That is one of the best things you can do as a teacher, is find people who can mentor you. And so when I went to Morocco, I'd been teaching for a long time. And so I came in thinking, oh, I'm just going to run this class like I normally do. And I have good classroom management. It won't be a problem. And very quickly, I realized that was not the case. And so I went to teachers who had been at the school for several years, and I talked to them like, all right, what techniques work? And so I think, if I was giving advice to a young educator or a new educator, that is one of the things that's important, is to get somebody who can mentor you, and don't be afraid to ask for help when you realize okay, this is not working. Find the people who do something well. We were talking about this the other day in one of our things at school, how that if you see someone who can line up all their children well and they make it to the cafeteria quietly and in line, maybe you should go ask them, how do you do your kids, how do you get them to be that way? And so finding people who can really truly mentor you and help give you advice and say, well, have you tried this? Have you tried this? And a lot of times it is a trial and error.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. So across this long career of teaching in different schools, what has helped you keep going and not burn out or just give up and exit the field? Because I think the average now is teachers last like 3 years.
Yeah. And burnout is one of the biggest things that problems we face in education. I will tell you, this year has been a struggle with COVID and everything. And if there was ever a year that I wanted to just say, I'm done, this might have been it. I think that my passion for education has really been the thing that has kept me moving. There's never been a point where I didn't want to. When I came back from Turkey, I knew I was going to go back overseas, but I was staying in America for a year. So I was not able to find a teaching position, and I was trying, and I missed it so much. So much of my identity was like, I'm a teacher. I think one of the important things that you have to do, and this is something that I'm not always very good at, is that you really have to manage your stress level. One of the things that I've been trying to do, like last year, I've been teaching, like I said, for 20 some years, yet I still struggle. And last year was a really tough year. I had some tough students, and I had to start setting boundaries for myself. And I think that is one of the important things to do. I've had some of my former students who are now teachers who called me for advice, and that's one of the things that I've talked to them about is setting boundaries. And that, leaving school, those kind of things. When I was in the international school, some of those boundaries are hard because you're with the community all the time. And so it is important for you to take time for yourself and to make sure you're taking care of your kind of emotional health. There's a saying that we kind of have in America. When you're on an airplane, they always tell you that you have to put on your own oxygen mask before you put on the oxygen mask of your child. And so I think that's important that we remember as educators that we have to take care of ourselves before we can, and we have to be healthy before we can do that for our students. But what I see in young teachers who just get burnt out is that they're just overwhelmed. And I think sometimes that leaders in our schools, that we don't help our new teachers enough. We often give them a lot of different preparations, lessons, and so that can be difficult. It is super important that you have some type of mentor that can help you with those kind of things, and so that you're not so overwhelmed. As department chair, that's one of the things that I try to do. One of my teachers today, we have our first day of school is tomorrow, and she's freaking out. And I'm like, all right, what can I do to help you? And I've been doing this a little bit longer. Let me come and make this part, for you easier. And so if you have a good support system, I think it's also important to find, especially if you're married, I don't think you always need to be venting to your spouse. It's good to have work friends who you can vent to, so that you can get some of that out, so that you can have healthy relationships outside of school as well.
Yeah, good thoughts. Last big question to dive into. So there are a lot of people in the world who, when they think of history, think, this is the most boring subject in the world. It's a bunch of names.
They're wrong.
So what are some things that you have found really effective in getting students excited about history?
I think you need to see how history is relevant to you. And I think that's one of the most important things. Like, for example, like we were talking about religions earlier. So, for example, one of my lessons I have to do this year is teach my students about Islam. And they may think, why do I need to know about that? How is that important to me? Well, 20% of the world are Muslim, and we cannot live in ignorance. And when we look at things that have happened in America, racism and Islamophobia, like those stem from ignorance. And so I think it's showing how relevant things are, showing connections. I remember one of the most beautiful teaching moments I ever had. I was teaching Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We were doing the monotheistic religions, and we were doing a tri-Venn diagram, comparing all three. And one of my students, who's probably the most country boy you ever met in your life, he's like, we're really not all that different. And I was like, exactly, that aha moment. And so it became relevant to him at that point. And so history does repeat itself. When we look at things that are happening in the world today, some of them should alarm us, as we can see that those things have happened in the past before. And there's that old saying, those who don't, remember history are doomed to repeat it. But to me, I think it's again, just making it relevant to them. And I think as well that if you are passionate about what you teach, the kids will be. One of my students, she told me one day, I was getting ready to start a different part of our lesson. She's like, oh good, I need to pay attention now. And I was like, why? She's like, you have your excited voice on. And I was like, oh. And so that whole, as soon as I was talking about the French Revolution, all right, this is super exciting stuff. And when you're telling these stories, I think stories also make it very relevant. For example, in the French Revolution, I love to tell the stories about the fishwives who marched on Versailles, and we're talking about angry mamas and, making it relevant to them. You don't want to make your mama mad. What happens when mamas can't feed their babies? They are mad. They want that queen's head on a stick. And so those are the things I think that really engage students. They want to see that you're excited about what you're teaching. And I think that applies to any content that you're doing. If you're not excited, they're not going to be excited.
That's a great, that should be really helpful for all of us out there. And something that's definitely a pattern that I've seen and read teachers saying over and over again, that you can tell, and the students can tell, when their teacher wants to be there and when they don't.
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
So we'll use this as our concluding question. So think back with everything you know now about teaching, all the lessons, all the experience. What things would you tell that first year teacher you before you started a day in the classroom? What advice would you give her just starting out?
Oh, that's hard. So many things. First, it's going to be okay. Don't be as stressed and worried as you are. And that if you are invested in your students, they will know. If you care about them, they will know. And stick to your guns. If you say it, mean it, and follow through. I think that's where a lot of teachers fail, in the fact that they don't follow through in what they say. I have a bit of a reputation, kids know that, I run a tight ship, but they come in with that expectation now, and that's something that I had to build. But when I say it, I mean it, and I'm going to follow through. And the classrooms that I see that have poor classroom management, they don't follow through. They make threats, empty threats. The same things when you see parents who are like, stop doing that, stop doing that, stop doing that. There has to be, a follow through. Right. But love what you do, and it's not just a job. It truly is a career, and you have an opportunity to touch students. And that saying that if you just reach one, it's worth it, and it really is. And sometimes we don't see the impact that we have. We're lucky when we get to, or they come back to us and they tell us man, I really appreciate, but those are the moments you kind of live for. And so keep those little tokens, and when people tell you those things, and when you're having a rough day, you can always pull that out and be like, all right, yes, I did make a difference in the life of this child. And that is what matters.
Yeah, it wasn't for nothing.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Crystal, for being with us today.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, and stay tuned in next time for our next episode to continue learning more advice from teachers all over the world. And hopefully these techniques, these experiences are helpful in your classroom too. Thanks. Have a good day. Bye.